She walked into a billion-dollar company on her first day and was humiliated in front of everyone. But no one knew who she really was. They thought she was a nobody until the CEO announced her. Before we start, leave a comment and indicate which city you are sharing from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The glass doors slid open with a hiss, and the first thing I felt was the weight of the eyes. Not the curious kind. Not the welcoming kind. The kind that judged, measured, and dismissed in a single glance. My heels clicked against the marble floor, echoing louder than the low hum of conversation in the lobby. I wore a plain black coat, still damp from the drizzle outside, and a cream dress that had seen better days. No jewelry. No designer label shouting my worth. I didn't need any of that. But to them it was all they needed to decide who they thought I was. A young man in a pristine uniform, probably no older than 22, looked at me and then quickly looked away. His superior, a tall woman with sleek blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, approached with a smile so thin it could cut glass. "The service entrance is around the corner," she said without a single pause, as though she'd been rehearsing the line all morning. I stood still for a moment, meeting her gaze. "I'm not here to deliver anything," I replied, keeping my voice calm, even warm. "I'm here to check in." She blinked, her smile stiffening. "Name?" "Danielle Carter." The sound of my name didn't ring a bell for her, and I hadn't expected it to. She tapped on the keyboard, her manicured nails making small, impatient clicks. "I'm sorry, I don't see a reservation under that name. Check under Carter Global Holdings." Her hands froze mid-type. The change in her face was subtle but telling. Still, she straightened her shoulders, clearly unwilling to let go of her original assumption. "Do you have identification?" I pulled a small black wallet from my coat pocket and slid a card and my license across the counter. She took them as if they might burn her fingers. The young man glanced over her shoulder, read the name on the card, and his eyes widened, though he said nothing. The woman swallowed hard, then offered a strained, "One moment, please." Without another word, she walked off toward a hallway behind the desk. I turned to take in the lobby, the towering crystal chandelier, the polished brass, the low murmur of people wondering who I was and why I was being stalled. Some smirked. Some whispered. It was amazing how people revealed themselves in moments like this. And I stood there quietly, letting them. When she returned, she was flanked by a man in a tailored navy suit. He had the composed expression of someone used to fixing problems before they reached the headlines. "Miss Carter," he said with a slight bow of the head. "Welcome to our headquarters. We've been expecting you." His tone alone sent ripples through the crowd. The blonde stiffened beside him, her face pale now, and I could feel the tension rolling off her. The man turned to the others in the lobby and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "For those of you who may not know Ms. Carter is the daughter of Marcus Carter, and a senior advisor to our global board. She is here on a special assignment from the CEO himself." The room went still. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just let the truth hang in the air, watching the sudden shift in their eyes, the fear, the embarrassment, the calculation. I took my card and license back, slipped them into my coat, and met the blonde woman's gaze one last time. "Thank you for the warm welcome," I said softly. But in my head I was already thinking. This was only the first test. And I had just seen exactly who would fail the next one. Tomorrow they'd learn why I was really here. I sat in the corner office the CEO had assigned me, though I kept the blinds half drawn to avoid the staring eyes from across the floor. People didn't know what to make of me yet, but their whispers carried through the thin glass. They speculated about my title, about my connection to Marcus Carter, about why a woman who looked too young and too quiet was suddenly here with a past that opened every restricted door in the building. None of them knew the truth. That was the point. I had never intended to step into this company wearing my name like armor. In fact, the plan was the opposite. My father, Marcus Carter, had been a silent force behind this empire for decades. People thought of him as a philanthropist, a man who built schools and funded hospitals. Few knew he'd been one of the earliest investors in this multinational, and fewer still knew how deeply he'd studied its inner workings. In the months before he passed, my father called me into his study late one night. I still remember the glow of the desk lamp on his weathered face, the faint smell of his black coffee, He slid a folder toward me without a word. Inside were documents, financial reports, complaint logs, whistleblower testimonies that had gone nowhere. This company, he said slowly, is rotting from the inside out. But if we go at it from the top, they'll close ranks. You have to go in quietly. See it, feel it, then fix it. I asked him why me. I was already running one of his foundations, overseeing education programs in 3 countries. He gave a half smile. Because you don't scare easy. And because you know what it's like to be underestimated. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to refuse. I'd grown up in boardrooms, listening to men talk over women, watching executives praise diversity in speeches, and then erase it in practice. I knew how exhausting it was to be the only one in the room they didn't expect to speak. But my father's eyes, fading but fierce, left me no choice. So I came here under the radar. No fanfare. No press. Just another junior consultant, in a sea of ambitious faces. But that was before the lobby scene. Before the CEO decided to announce who I really was. I understood her motives. Perhaps she wanted to shield me from the petty cruelty of her staff. But part of me wished she'd let me stay invisible a little longer. Now the game had changed. I could no longer pretend to be one of them. Every interaction would be tinted with fear, calculation, or false charm. That made my mission harder. I needed honesty from people who had no reason to trust me. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing a digital folder the CEO had quietly shared with me. Internal audits, HR summaries, and a disturbing spreadsheet of unresolved harassment complaints. Patterns began to emerge. Certain names appeared too often. Certain departments had turnover rates so high they should have triggered alarms. But the alarms had been silenced. I recognized the tactics. Isolate the problem, exhaust the complainant, quietly remove them before anyone noticed. By noon, I decided to take the elevator down to the lower floors, the parts of the building where executives rarely set foot. The air felt different there. The walls were plainer, the lighting harsher. People moved faster, eyes lowered. This was where the company's real work happened, yet it was also where the culture's cracks showed most. I introduced myself to a few employees in the break room, leaving my full title unsaid. One woman, a payroll clerk with tired eyes, looked at me with quiet curiosity. "You're new here, aren't you?" she asked. "Yes," I said, smiling faintly. "Just trying to understand how things work." She hesitated before answering. "They work fine. If you don't ask too many questions." That one sentence told me more than any report could. Back upstairs, I found a note slipped under my office door. No signature. Just 6 words written in shaky handwriting. "If you want the truth, listen." Beneath it was a time 9:30 p.m. and a conference room number I didn't recognize. I held the paper between my fingers for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. This could be a lead. Could also be a trap. Either way, I knew I'd be there. Because if my father taught me anything, it was that change never came to those who waited politely for permission. It came to those who walked straight into the room where they weren't wanted and stayed. By the time the building's last clusters of employees filtered out, the air had changed. The hum of conversation was gone, replaced by the low mechanical sigh of the ventilation system and the occasional echo of footsteps in distant hallways. I stayed in my office longer than necessary, deliberately finishing one more report before heading down to the floor where the assigned conference room was located. It was on level 5, a floor I hadn't visited before. The carpet was thinner here, the lighting dimmer, as though the company had decided appearances mattered less the further down you went. My heels made almost no sound as I walked the corridor, scanning door plaques until I found the right number. 5C12. The glass panel in the door had been frosted over from the inside. I knocked once. A pause. Then a soft voice. "Come in." The room was smaller than I expected, just a rectangular table, a flickering overhead light, and 2 people seated across from each other. One was a man I recognized faintly, an IT specialist I'd seen in passing, his ID badge swinging from a frayed lanyard. The other was the payroll clerk I'd spoken to earlier in the break room. Her eyes were sharper now, scanning me with intent. "You came," she said quietly, as though it were both a surprise and a relief. "I'm here," I replied, closing the door behind me. The man gestured to the chair at the far end of the table. We don't have much time. Security does sweeps every 40 minutes. They began with stories. Not gossip. Not the petty workplace gripes that fill HR inboxes, but patterns. Accounts of promotions denied after complaints were filed, of overtime mysteriously erased from timesheets, of entire teams restructured the week after raising concerns about safety violations. The payroll clerk slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of documents, internal memos, emails, payroll adjustments, each marked with dates and initials. This is only a fraction, she said. If you really want to see the truth, you'll need access to locked servers. We can't get that. But maybe you can. I didn't answer right away. I was weighing the risk. Taking this material and acting on it would make me a target. Then again, I had walked into this building knowing I would be one eventually. I'll take it, I said finally, sliding the folder toward me. But I need to know why now. Why tell me? The IT specialist leaned forward, elbows on the table. Because word travels fast. We all saw what happened in the lobby. We saw how you stood there. Most people, they react. They fight back or shrink away. You didn't do either. You waited. People who can wait like that, they're dangerous to the ones running this place. There was a knock at the door, sharp, impatient. The three of us froze. The payroll clerk mouthed security. The IT specialist reached over, flicked off the overhead light, and jerked his chin toward the side exit. I slid the folder into my bag and followed him through a narrow service corridor that smelled faintly of dust and electrical wiring. My heart was steady, not racing. I'd learned long ago that panic makes you clumsy. We emerged 2 floors down near a loading bay. The specialist stopped there. Don't call us. We'll find you. Keep the folder safe. I nodded and stepped out into the night air. The drizzle had turned to steady rain, misting my coat. Across the street, the company's glass facade reflected the city lights back at me. All glitter and polish. Inside I now knew was rot. And somewhere between those two truths was my mission. As I walked away, I thought about my father again, about the times he told me that most corruption survives not because of strength, but because of silence. I had just been handed voices that refused to stay silent any longer. The question now wasn't whether I could protect them. It was whether I could bring the whole truth into the light before the people in the shadows decided to erase me. The folder from the night before sat on my desk like a loaded weapon. I had barely closed my office door when the CEO called. Her voice was calm, too calm, as she asked me to join her upstairs. I carried the folder with me, not because I planned to show it to her yet, but because I didn't trust leaving it behind. Her office was all glass and steel, the kind of space designed to project control. She poured 2 cups of coffee and handed me one. I hear you've been making connections, she said, as though she were commenting on the weather. I've been listening, I replied. She studied me for a long moment, then leaned forward. Danielle, you need to understand something. This company is a fortress. You can chip away at it from the outside, but once you're in, you either play the game or the game plays you. And if you're planning to start an earthquake, you'd better know exactly where the fault lines are. I let her words settle before answering. I know exactly where one of them is, and I plan to stand right on it. For a split second, her mouth curved. Not quite a smile, more like recognition. Then be ready, she said, because they already know you're digging. When I left her office, 2 men I'd never seen before were leaning against the wall by the elevators. Expensive suits, blank expressions. They didn't speak, but one of them glanced at the folder in my hand, his gaze lingering a little too long. By mid-afternoon, my inbox began to fill with meeting requests from department heads I'd barely interacted with before. Every invite was marked urgent, every agenda vague. It was a coordinated move. Get me into closed rooms, flood me with meaningless data, try to steer me away from whatever I was close to finding. I accepted exactly one of them, operations. The head of operations greeted me in a conference room with a panoramic view of the city. The skyline stretched behind him like a prize he'd won. Danielle, he said warmly, gesturing to the seat opposite him. I wanted to welcome you personally. You've certainly made an impression. I've been told, I said, setting the folder on the table without opening it. He launched into a speech about teamwork, trust, and shared vision. The kind of corporate sermon that sounds noble but means nothing. When he finally paused, I leaned forward. I've been reviewing financial anomalies in several departments. There's a pattern, and I think you already know what I'm talking about." The smile on his face didn't falter, but something in his eyes tightened. "If you're suggesting impropriety, I'd caution you to tread carefully. Accusations have consequences for everyone." "I'm not accusing," I said evenly. "I'm observing. And I'll keep observing until I have enough to decide what comes next." We locked eyes for a few seconds too long. He was testing me. I was testing him back. Finally, he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Then I suppose we'll see how far your observations take you." I left the meeting knowing two things. First, that operations was deeply involved in whatever was festering here, and second, that they weren't going to wait for me to find proof. They were going to start pushing back now. When I returned to my office, my computer screen was black. It refused to power on. My phone too was dead, even though I'd left it charging. It was a warning, subtle, deniable, but clear. I opened the folder again, running my fingertips over the photocopied pages. They had tried to scare me into retreat, but all they'd done was confirm I was exactly where I needed to be. I knew they'd move faster now. So would I. The morning after my computer and phone mysteriously malfunctioned, I arrived at the office early enough that the corridors were still empty. I carried no electronics this time, only the folder and a notebook. If they wanted to monitor me, they'd have to do it the old-fashioned way. The first thing I did was walk straight to HR. Not to report the sabotage, that would have been too obvious, too easy for them to bury. Instead, I asked to review the onboarding records for the last 2 years. The HR director, a soft-spoken woman whose eyes darted toward the surveillance camera in the corner, hesitated before pulling up the files. I stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. Dozens of names, exit dates, termination codes. A pattern emerged almost instantly. Anyone who had filed more than one formal complaint was gone within 6 months. I thanked her, made a few mental notes, and left without taking copies. If she was loyal to the wrong people, I'd know soon enough. By midday, I had drafted my first move. It wouldn't be a frontal assault, too risky at this stage. No, this would be a precise strike at the people who thought their cruelty in the lobby had been forgotten. I sent out a company-wide email under my official advisory title, announcing a new employee culture feedback initiative, and inviting every staff member to submit anonymous reports directly to my office. The key detail was in the fine print. Participation would be considered in upcoming performance evaluations. The ripple was immediate. My inbox began to fill within the hour. Stories poured in about bullying, retaliation, quiet demotions. Some were raw, almost trembling with fear. Others were calculated, clearly meant to test my reaction. I read every one. Among the submissions was one from the receptionist who had turned me away on my first day. Her message was unexpectedly candid. She admitted to making a judgment about me, explained that her training encouraged filtering visitors who didn't fit a certain profile, and confessed that she'd been warned early on that speaking out about discrimination was career suicide. I called her into my office. She walked in stiffly, clearly expecting a reprimand. Instead, I told her I appreciated her honesty, and that she would be enrolled in a leadership development program, effective immediately. Her eyes widened. "Why would you do that? I was rude to you." "Because you told the truth," I said. "That's how change starts." Next, I turned my attention to the cobalt-dressed manager from the lobby. I requested her attendance at an internal review, and presented her with a detailed list of complaints from her team, each supported by documentation. She tried to deflect, to laugh it off as disgruntled employees exaggerating. I didn't smile. They all described the same incidents. Different people. Same pattern. Her posture shifted from confident to defensive. I didn't fire her, not yet. Instead, I placed her on immediate probation with mandatory oversight. She understood what that meant. Her power to intimidate was gone. By the end of the day, word had spread. Some avoided me entirely, slipping into elevators when they saw me coming. Others, mostly from the lower floors, began offering quiet nods or small smiles when we passed in the hallway. That night, I stayed late to organize the reports into categories, looking for the next target. As I was leaving, I found another note slipped under my office door. No name, just a sentence in block letters. "You've made enemies with deep pockets." I stood in the empty hallway holding the note. Good. I'd been waiting for them to show themselves. The warning note still sat on my desk when I arrived the next morning, right beside my coffee. I didn't hide it. I wanted anyone walking past my open door to see it and wonder whether I was rattled. I wasn't, but they didn't need to know that. What unsettled me wasn't the threat itself, but the timing. It meant my moves from yesterday had struck a nerve, and they were done whispering in the shadows. They were stepping out. By 10 o'clock, I had my first sign of how they planned to hit back. The CEO called an emergency, all hands meeting in the main auditorium, something that usually happened only when quarterly results came in or a merger was announced. I could feel the eyes on me as I walked in, the way people subtly leaned toward their neighbors to exchange quiet remarks. The stage lights cast the CEO in a pale glow as she thanked everyone for their dedication during challenging times. I listened closely to the subtext. Her voice carried a tension I hadn't heard before. Then came the pivot. Unfortunately, she said, there have been recent incidents of misinformation and unverified accusations spreading internally. I want to make it clear that Artemis Global stands for integrity, and we will not tolerate actions that undermine trust within our team. I knew exactly what she was doing. This was theater for the people watching. A carefully crafted message to cast doubt on the legitimacy of what I'd been uncovering. It wasn't a direct attack, but the implication was sharp enough to leave a mark. When she finished, the head of operations stepped forward. His tone was warmer, almost paternal, as he spoke about the danger of overzealous reform and the need for balance. The audience nodded along. It was an old tactic. Paint yourself as the reasonable voice in a storm, and let the listener fill in the villain on their own. When it was over, people began filing out, conversations low and cautious. I stayed in my seat until most of the room was empty, then walked straight to the CEO's side stage exit. She was there, leaning against a wall, arms crossed. That was quite the performance, I said. Her eyes flicked to mine. I'm protecting the company from chaos, and from you burning it down before you even understand its foundations. I stepped closer, my voice low but steady. I've seen enough to know which parts are rotten. If they collapse under the weight of the truth, that's not me burning it down, that's gravity. We stood there in silence for a moment, the air between us sharp. Then she said, they're coming for you, Danielle. Not with memos. Not with notes. With something that sticks. I left without answering, but my mind was already turning over what something that sticks could mean. The answer came that afternoon. An anonymous email was sent to hundreds of employees, complete with a PDF attachment. A fabricated report, painting me as a nepotistic plant, here to secure lucrative contracts for my father's foundation. It cited unnamed sources and twisted fragments of truth into a story just believable enough to seed doubt. I could almost admire the craftsmanship. Almost. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with messages, some supportive, others politely asking for clarification. I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I drafted a company-wide message of my own, short and measured. Facts withstand scrutiny. Fabrications crumble under it. I invite any employee with concerns about my role to meet with me directly, in person, anytime this week. My door is open. By evening, 5 people had already shown up. The last was the payroll clerk who'd given me the first folder. She shut my office door and said, "They're scared, Danielle. This means you're close." Close to what exactly I didn't know yet. But I could feel it. The walls were beginning to shift. And shifting walls tend to crush whatever they were built to protect. The smear campaign didn't slow me down. It sharpened my focus. If they were resorting to character assassination, it meant I'd wandered too close to something they couldn't afford me to touch. I went back to the folder from the payroll clerk, cross-referencing names, dates, and incident codes with the confidential audit logs the CEO had reluctantly granted me access to. At first it was the usual mid-level managers abusing expense accounts, department heads quietly burying harassment claims. Ugly but predictable. Then I saw it. A string of approvals for questionable vendor contracts, each worth just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic board review. The signatory on all of them was the same, Victor Hale, the company's senior vice president of global strategy. The man whose speeches were played at leadership retreats like gospel. The man employees spoke of in reverent tones, as if he'd personally built the walls of this company with his own hands. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor painting my office in pale light. I'd met Hale once years ago when my father brought me to an award gala. He'd been charming, almost fatherly, telling me how proud Marcus must be of my accomplishments. I remembered thinking he was exactly the kind of leader this industry needed. Now I was staring at a trail of digital breadcrumbs leading from his desk to a network of shell companies and inflated invoices. It wasn't just about money. Buried in the attachments were NDAs, binding, punitive ones, signed by employees who had filed harassment complaints against senior staff. All of them routed through Hale's department. The contracts read like ransom notes. Silence in exchange for severance, under the guise of mutual separation agreements. I knew what exposing him would mean. It wouldn't be like putting the cobalt-dressed lobby manager on probation. This would shake the company's image to its core. For some people here, it would be like hearing that the son was a fraud. I printed the files, locking them in the secure cabinet in my office. My instinct was to go straight to the CEO. But then I remembered her warning after the auditorium meeting. They're coming for you. If she was already trying to manage my moves, would she shield Hale to save the company's reputation? Or worse, was she part of the shield around him? The decision weighed on me all afternoon. If I moved too soon, they could bury the evidence and spin the story until I became the villain in their fairy tale. If I waited, more people could be hurt, silenced, pushed out, or worse. At 5, I stepped into the elevator with the folder under my arm. As the doors began to close, a hand slipped between them. It was the junior analyst, the same one who'd smirked at me in the lobby on my first day. He didn't smirk now. "I know what you found," he said quietly. "And I know where the rest of it is. But you won't like what it means." The doors slid shut behind him, and the elevator began its slow descent. I didn't speak. I just waited. When we reached the lobby, he handed me a flash drive. "You have to look at it tonight. Not at the office. And when you do, you'll understand why no one has ever been able to touch him." He walked away without another word, leaving me standing there, the drive cold in my palm. I knew whatever was on it would change everything. The only question was whether it would destroy them or me. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove to a quiet corner of the city where an old friend of my father's kept a private office above a bookstore. It was one of the few places I trusted to plug in a flash drive without prying eyes. The rain had turned into a steady downpour, muting the city's noise as I sat at the desk and inserted the drive. The first folder was labeled Project Ascent. Inside were subfolders, each named after a year. I opened the most recent. Contracts, payment records, travel logs, all tying Victor Hale to a network of front companies funneling funds out of international operations. The money trail was precise, deliberate, and years in the making. It was the kind of operation that couldn't survive without allies in high places. Then I found something that made my throat tighten. A scanned letter 10 years old on Carter Foundation letterhead. My father's signature at the bottom. The contents were a formal endorsement for one of Hale's overseas initiatives, which, according to the files, had been a cover for laundering funds through charitable projects. I leaned back in the chair, my pulse pounding in my ears. My father wasn't a corrupt man. I knew that in my bones. But whether through trust or ignorance, he had lent his name to something that was now part of Hale's empire. If I brought this into the open, I wouldn't just take down Hale. I'd drag my father's name through the mud with him. The temptation to shut the laptop and pretend I'd never seen it was almost physical. But the faces of the people I'd spoken to over the past weeks, the payroll clerk, the junior analyst, the receptionist trying to rebuild her career, came to mind. They hadn't turned away from the truth, even when it put them at risk. Could I? I copied the entire drive to an encrypted folder, then removed it from the laptop. My plan shifted in that moment. I would not hand this to the CEO or to internal compliance. I'd seen enough to know both could be compromised. Instead, I would build a chain of evidence so airtight it could survive the company's PR machine and whatever political strings Hale might pull. On my way out of the bookstore, I spotted a man across the street in a dark coat, holding an umbrella but not moving. The rain fell around him in sheets, yet he didn't step forward or back. He was just watching. I got into my car without glancing at him again, but my grip on the steering wheel was tight all the way back to my apartment. Inside, I locked every door, set the drive in a safe, and opened my notebook. Tomorrow I would start connecting the names, the executives, the shell companies, the complicit board members. I would map it all, not for a report but for something bigger. Something public. Still, my father's signature burned in my mind. If I went through with this, the company's corruption would be exposed. But so would his mistake. And I wasn't sure yet which truth would cost me more. By the next morning I had a plan. It wasn't elegant and it wasn't safe, but it was the only way to make sure the truth saw daylight before it could be buried. I arranged for a secure meeting with an investigative journalist I trusted. Someone my father had once worked with on exposing a predatory bank. I sent her a message through a back channel. Meet me tonight. No phones. Bring nothing you can't lose. The entire day at the office felt like moving through hostile territory. Hale wasn't in his corner suite when I passed by, but his absence didn't comfort me. The looks I was getting told me he'd been busy. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Doors that had been open before were now closed. Even the CEO kept her distance, which told me she knew something was about to happen and didn't want to be standing next to me when it did. At 2 o'clock my access badge stopped working. The security guard at the elevator claimed it was probably a technical glitch, but the smirk he tried to hide told me it was deliberate. I walked down 5 flights of stairs instead, past groups of employees who suddenly found the floor tiles fascinating. When I got back to my office, the door was ajar. Inside, my desk drawers were open, papers scattered, the secure cabinet unlocked. The flash drive was still there, but I knew better than to believe that meant it hadn't been copied. Whoever had come in wanted me to know they could reach me, and my evidence, whenever they pleased. That should have shaken me. Instead, it clarified everything. If I didn't move now, they would erase not only the data but also any credibility I had left. By evening, I'd stripped my notes down to essentials, packed the drive, and left through the underground parking garage instead of the main exit. I drove without my headlights for the first 2 blocks, scanning my mirrors. A black sedan kept pace half a block back, too consistent to be random. I took 3 turns in quick succession. It stayed with me. When I reached the meeting spot, a disused community center on the edge of the city, I parked behind the building and slipped inside through the service door. The journalist was already there, sitting at a folding table under a single bare bulb. Her expression was calm, but I could see the questions in her eyes. I set the flash drive on the table. Everything you need is here. Financial trails, internal communications, NDAs, and the name at the center of it all. She reached for it, but I held up a hand. Before you open it, you need to know my father's name is in there too. Not because he was part of this, but because Hale used him. If you publish, his legacy will be dragged through the same mud. I'm not asking for protection. I'm asking if you're prepared for that weight. Her gaze didn't waver. The truth doesn't care who it burns, Danielle. And neither should you. Before I could answer, a sound echoed from the hallway, the metallic creak of the main door opening. The journalist froze. I slipped the drive into her jacket pocket and whispered, "Go. Now." She left through the back, and I stepped into the hallway just as 2 men in dark coats rounded the corner. No badges, no introductions, just that slow, predatory walk I'd learned to recognize. They stopped a few feet from me. One smiled faintly. "You've been busy." I met his eyes without blinking. "You have no idea." And in that moment I realized this wasn't just about taking Hale down anymore. It was about surviving the night long enough to make sure the truth couldn't be buried with me. The 2 men didn't touch me. They didn't have to. Their presence was a message in itself. A warning, a test, maybe even an invitation to fold before it was too late. One of them stepped closer, his polished shoes silent against the old linoleum. "You're making mistakes that can't be undone," he said, his voice low and almost conversational. I took a step toward him until there were only inches between us. "So are you." We stood there in a silence that felt heavier than shouting. Then, without another word, they turned and walked out the way they came. No threats, no last looks. It was as if they already knew that their time to act was over, or that someone else would be doing the work for them. I didn't wait to find out which. I slipped out through the back exit and drove home, my body tense, my mind locked on a single thought. If the journalist made it out with the drive, the clock was already ticking. The next 48 hours were a blur. I didn't go into the office. I didn't answer calls, not even from the CEO. Every hour I checked the news, waiting for the first crack in the wall. Came on the second morning. The headline wasn't subtle. Artemis Global Senior VP. Linked to international fraud and harassment cover-ups. Hale's name was in bold type, but so was mine. Not as a suspect, but as the whistleblower who had provided the evidence. They didn't spare my father's connection either. The article was careful to note that there was no proof he had been aware of the fraud, but his signature on those old documents was enough to raise questions. By noon it was everywhere: television, radio, social feeds flooded with commentary. Employees from Artemis began speaking publicly, some confirming the details, others thanking me by name. Investors demanded answers. The board suspended Hale pending an investigation, and by evening, the CEO announced a complete overhaul of compliance and HR protocols. It should have felt like victory. In some ways it did. I thought of the payroll clerk, the receptionist, the quiet nods in hallways. For them, this was more than headlines. It was proof that someone could stand up and not be erased. But victory comes with shadows. My father's name trended alongside Hale's for 3 days straight. Old allies of his called me, some to offer support, others to accuse me of tarnishing his legacy. I kept thinking about the night in his study when he told me to go in quietly, to see it, feel it, then fix it. I wondered if he'd imagined the fixing would come at this cost. A week later I walked through the lobby of Artemis again. The stares were different now, cautious, respectful, some even admiring. The cobalt-dressed manager was gone. The receptionist greeted me with a steady voice and no trace of the condescension from that first day. The CEO met me at the elevator. "You got what you wanted," she said. "No," I replied. "I got what the company needed." We rode up in silence. When the doors opened, I stepped out alone, knowing my role here was finished. My mission had never been to stay. It was to leave behind a place where the next Danielle Carter wouldn't have to walk through those doors and wonder who was already planning to cut her down. That night I sat on my balcony, the city lights stretching out in front of me. I thought about my father, about the enemies I'd made, and about the fragile, messy thing called change. It never arrives clean. It drags its own consequences, forces you to live with truths you wish you could unsee. But as I watched the skyline, I knew I would make the same choice again. Because sometimes the only way to protect a legacy is to risk losing it, and the only way to change a system is to burn away the rot until even the strongest walls let in the light. And for the first time since walking into that lobby, I felt the weight lift. Not gone, but lighter. Enough to take the next step wherever it led.